For part two, Mark explores the need for a new political vision. Transitioning from his critique of traditional socialism, Satin explores the necessity for a fresh political paradigm that harmonizes economic innovation with social responsibility. In this phase, he co founded New Options, a publication dedicated to transcending the conventional left right political spectrum. Sound familiar? His experiences in Washington, D.C., and interactions with various decentralist and environmental groups influenced his perspective. Satin emphasizes the shortcomings of both socialism and unregulated capitalism, advocating for a flexible and humane political framework that addresses contemporary challenges without being constrained by outdated ideologies. Enjoy. Hey, Mark, I've really missed you. Where have you been? I feel like it's been forever since we talked.
Yeah, it's been over a day. My God.
Oh man, I was counting the minutes. I think where we left off, we were in Canada. We're talking about. I have lots more that I admire about you that I could talk about. But should we finish the journey? What came after Canada? We haven't even gotten to law school yet.
Oh man, we haven't even gotten to Vancouver yet. I'm leaving out so much of the social and personal, get at the political. And when people read my book, they'll see that all these things are melded together in ways that you really shouldn't separate. I was living with a woman at the time who happened to be the principal media figure in Canada's version of SDS, the Student Union for Peace Action. She was about as far left as you could get. And I mentioned to her that I wanted to go back to school so I could figure out how to bring all the new ideas together in a book that would illuminate our new political perspective. She was not happy with that at all. What she wanted me to do was go back to university and learn chemical engineering so we could blow up train tracks in Canada. This was not my cup of tea. Yeah. So after TADP, we sort of drifted apart. I decided to take my enterprise west. And I left for Vancouver, where I already had many friends and contacts. And I engaged in what Marilyn Ferguson called my anti-ambition experiment. Years and years of hanging out.
Oh, yeah.
Communes, collectives, doing all sorts of part-time jobs, including working at a union job in Oregon. I snuck down to the US for a couple of months. I just did everything to find out what my generation was thinking and feeling. And it was fascinating to live with only one goal, that is to soak up both the writings and on a more personal level, how we were living, how we wanted to live differently from the establishment and also from the socialist view of how humanity should be. We were much more individualistic, and even though we didn't anyway. Let's just say that after a couple of years, I finally did go back to school. Did very well in it. Got a fellowship to the University of Toronto. I was able to go there to graduate school for free. And that lasted for 6 weeks. I could not stand being in a place that did not allow me to do exactly what I wanted. Once again, I was being very stubborn, probably too stubborn for my own good, because I think the book that came out of all that, New Age Politics it's called, would have been much deeper had I gotten my master's and my PhD. Mind you, it was free. They'd given me a free scholarship. But yeah. I they would not let me study Theodore Roszak, Louis Mumford, Doris Lessing, all the stars of my generation who are trying to create a new political perspective. It was much too anti-traditional for them. So I dropped out, went back to my free love commune and other communes, and spent another couple of years hanging out with friends, working at part-time jobs, and creating this, what ultimately came a 350-page book called New Age Politics. Nobody was interested in publishing it. None of the, I went to 48 publishers, literally 48 publishers and literary agents. None of them were interested in it because none of them understood. It's sort of like today, none of them understood that between the status quo and socialism, there was a whole new area opening up that people were interested in. They just didn't get it. So I had to publish the first edition myself. I took it to a fair in Vancouver called the World Symposium on Humanity. And immediately it became a big hit there. It sold out. A couple of publishers became interested. A Canadian publisher first brought it out. Utne Reader brought it out in serial. I got to meet Eric Utne that way. I think it was his first major political article. So we had a bond going back all the way to 1977. And the Toronto Star, bless them, did a huge attack on it on their editorial page. But besides being an attack, they actually said what was in the book. So that helped get it around too. So long story short, I was able to get from this publicity a couple of speaking invitations, and Jimmy Carter stunned the draft dodgers in Canada by actually doing what he said he would and pardoning us on his second day in office, which happened to be exactly the month that my Canadian publisher brought it out in a new spiffy edition. And I was able to get, within a couple of weeks, a major speaking invitation to what was called then the Equinox Gathering, which is the largest gathering of political activists up and down the West Coast. It was held between Eugene, Oregon, and Portland, Oregon. And of course, I'd never spoken to anything like a big crowd before, and I was nervous. I mean, really, really nervous, partly because I had decided two things that were very important for what I felt was transformational politics. I would not dress in a fancy suit or robe or anything like that. I would not in any way try to pretend that I was different from the people I was speaking to. This was a very different approach at the time, late 70s. The other thing I did was I did not want to come across, even though I'd just written a huge book, I did not want to come across as more knowledgeable or sophisticated than anyone else, especially since I really wasn't. I mean, I just put in the work, but I wasn't particularly above anyone. And I didn't want to pretend that I was, so I did not write my speech out in advance.
Yeah.
So, of course, I couldn't sleep the night before. And when I started the speech, the Equinox Gathering, I couldn't figure out what to say. And people were screaming and laughing at me. It was fairly awful. But I finally got going. And I was able to get out what was in my book and what was in my heart. And it was very, very wonderful. And I cried because people were so happy. And people loved the fact that I just got an amnesty, and I was about to go around the US, I said, for 2 years, giving talks and workshops. I mean, that sounded crazy at the time, but I actually did it. For 2 years, I was on the road, speaking to almost 90 groups. One speech led to 2 or 3 others. And the one after that, by the way, was to planetary citizens, exactly the opposite kind of group from Equinox Gathering. Equinox was in a park, and the people that were there were essentially activist hippies. But at the Planetary Citizens Group, which was in New York, it was in sort of a castle overlooking the Hudson River to 20 miles north of New York City. And everyone there was perfumed and working for the government or working for nonprofits or working for UN agencies. But I felt very full of myself then, and I was able to come across in a way that kind of inspired people to think about the difference between socialism and what we were creating as young people, deeply interested in ecology, in spirituality, in humanistic psychology, in figuring out how consciousness change was probably more important than economic status in terms of figuring out who is ready to move on from this production consumption merry-go-round that was frankly boring and provided very little meaning in life.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's how I saw things at the time. And one wonderful thing that happened during these 2 years is at a sociology conference, I ran into a salesperson from Dell Publishing Company, and they brought it out in paperback. And that, of course, turned it into a much, much, much bigger book. Not an underground Canadian book at all, but a major American book. And it ultimately sold 35,000 copies. It's pretty much forgotten today. You can get it on online and from Amazon. But at the time, it was a big deal. And it was ultimately published in Germany and Sweden. And it was positively reviewed in both the libertarian press and in The Nation and other left-wing presses. Very few books get that sort of broad interest until my most recent book, by the way. But the wonderful thing about it is that not only did it bring more people to my workshops and talks all over the country, but it inspired me to develop the idea of creating a new political organization based on the ideas in the book. So I began getting people's names and addresses on note cards. And at the end of the 2 years, I had almost 2,000 note cards of people who wanted to do something based on the kinds of ideas I was writing about, which of course weren't just my ideas. I was synthesizing the ideas of many folks whose ideas fell between the status quo and socialism without rejecting either the mainstream or socialism. But I should say, I was much more arrogant in my beliefs than I was today. I felt I had I felt we, and we felt that we had the answer, an alternative answer. So we did, in fact, create an organization. But I made 2 terrible errors in creating this organization, which became known as the New World Alliance. Now we're into part 2 of my book, by the way, creating a new transformational point of view. Basically, that's what the second of the 3 parts of my Up From Socialism book is about.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the problems. We were all into collective work and consensus. I was too. I felt this was the hot new thing. So rather than figuring out the best people of those 1,800 people that I met who would be on the board of directors of this new organization, and rather than deciding what the initial political perspective of this organization should be, I turned it over with the help of a group of friends and colleagues in San Francisco. I turned it over to a questionnaire, which we sent out to 500 people on the mailing list.
Hmm.
This was a horrible mistake. It's not how Democratic Socialists of America started. It's not how Moral Majority started. It's not how Common Cause started. All those groups started with one person who sort of knew the lay of the land and at least set out the structure of the thing before it was
Yeah.
turned over to a board of directors. I did not do that because I, like everyone of my generation who shared my beliefs, felt that everything should be done collectively. That was my
Yeah.
first mistake. My second mistake was more personal. Although there were several people who were willing to move to Washington and be with me at the time, I, even though I was 32, I was most attracted to a 22-year-old musician and mime who knew very little about politics, but we cared for each other very much. And so she moved in with me near Washington, D.C. But the problem was, you don't start a national political organization without an intimate partner. Okay, I got that right. But without an intimate partner who's on your wavelength in
Yeah.
terms of interests and political interests. And also, I mean, she was 22. She lacked a lot of my experiences, and as a result, um, the bond wasn't as close as it might have been. So it wasn't as supportive for either of us, I should say, as I needed it to be in order to carry out what I set out to do.
I
So,
suspect a lot of men have experience with that problem.
no, how do you know this? I'm sorry. This isn't. Yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
that's not the main point of the book, but
I,
yeah, I agree.
well, it is one of the main points of the book. There's several other relationships I've skipped over in terms of getting us up to this point. I've spared you. I've spared the audience, but all of it, I mean, all of the problems that not all of the problems, many of the problems that I and many of the other activists of my day had were because we did not have mature relationships with the women in our lives or with the colleagues in our lives or with our parents. This was, for many of us, sort of secondary to changing the world.
Hmm.
And it's not how to live. I mean, I'm sorry. My book is not preachy. I don't tell people that I was doing things wrong. But people reading the book can see, without my having to lecture them, the kinds of personal and interpersonal mistakes that I and many of my colleagues were making. In that sense, the book is just as relevant for people today as it might have been had it come out 20 or 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
all that is very. I mean, it's salacious is too strong a word, but entertaining and interesting.
it's
Yeah.
yes, the book is much more entertaining than any description I can give of it here. And I wouldn't call it salacious, but
Yeah.
it is heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. And anyway, have we moved beyond Valerie yet? Yes.
Well, but I think I just wanted to mention to people watching that it's authentic, and I think you're right. And again, it's you laying it all out there with the hopes that folks can learn from your mistakes too. And it's not all just a book of mistakes, you know, Mark. It's
No,
there's a lot of great success in there too.
I tend to be super critical of myself, but that's a lifelong flaw. It makes for a good writer, not necessarily for a good organizer. Anyway, the New World Alliance, because the questionnaire process decided even who would be on the first board of directors, and the people who filled out the questionnaire got to see, 89 of them wanted to be on the board. So they got to choose people based on their resumes. And when you look at people's resumes and you haven't met them face to face like I did, you're impressed by golden resumes, right? So the people that were chosen were not the people who I knew from the start would not be the most cooperative with each other. Many of them were prima donnas. Others of them were rightly felt that they'd been ignored and wanted to make a name for themselves in the group. Still others themselves were such true believers that they could only insisted on operating if certain conditions were met, because we insisted on a full consensus decision making. If when people disagreed, the group was stymied and very little got done.
Is this also where you met Charlene Spretnak?
No, Charlene came in with the Green Party movement.
Oh, the Green
Don't
Party.
worry, Charlene is coming
We'll
later.
get to her.
But there are other versions of her in this organization. Yeah. There was a very articulate spiritual political person named Corrine McLaughlin, and she had a very decisive influence on the group. Let's leave it with this. These people did not get along. But what made it sad and hypocritical is that they all believed in spirituality and love and cooperation. But they couldn't cooperate because they just hadn't done the work. They hadn't done the personal work that would allow them to cooperate with people that were equally strong-minded and equally smart. It was not just activists. It was people from government, people from business, people from the media, and it included a wide range of political beliefs too. There were some people that believed primarily in global cooperation, others that were strict decentralists. My book, my current book, Up From Socialism, was recently reviewed on, a major left-wing website. And the reviewer kind of laughed at my description of some of the meetings of the New World Alliance and said that some of those could have been on Saturday Night Live. It was true. They were, on one level, they were hilarious. And when I wasn't weeping over them in the book, I described them to bring out the humor of it. It's much funnier now than it was at the time, though. At the time, it was heartbreaking because I'd spent 2 years trying to get this group together. And there were so many high hopes for it in so many quarters. In any event, it imploded. But one good thing that came out of it, I was running the newsletter of the organization, and that newsletter morphed after the organization imploded into something called a New Options newsletter. It allowed me to start New Options newsletter because I already had a base of people that belonged to the organization. And then because I wanted to create it, I wanted to create it as an entrepreneurial enterprise. I had to learn entrepreneurship from scratch. In many ways, this was my favorite chapter in the book because you had a dyed-in-the-wool political activist having to figure out from scratch what it took to be an entrepreneur. It was really a roller coaster ride for a while. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine from the Calvert Social Investment Fund, helped me work out a business plan. Of course, I'd never seen one before. I had no idea that there were such things or that they were so complicated and that there was so much went into building a business up. And of course, I hired a woman to help me help me administer the organization. And I chose her not because she was the most competent person, but because basically I fell for her and I could identify with her. And that created terrible problems, which were ironed out over time by my firing her and almost losing all of the money that we'd ever raised for the newsletter.
And that it was this at this point, are you in Dupont Circle yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
we were in Dupont Circle because this administrator loved the Dupont Circle building because the Dupont Circle building was full of left-wing organizations, and her
Yeah.
heart was really on the left. She
Yeah.
began ragging on me right away because nobody in the building was reading me. Of course, they weren't reading me because I wasn't writing a newsletter for the left. I was writing it for people trying to go beyond left and right. But
Mm-hmm.
she didn't like my politics, it turned out. She felt that my attempt to build up the circulation base was way too aggressive. I was doing large um, direct mailings to mailing lists. Roger Craver of the Craver Matthew Smith direct mail firm had gotten hold of my newsletter when I was doing the New World Alliance newsletter, and he loved it. And he sent me a contribution and later called me up and asked me if I needed his help. I couldn't believe it. This
Yeah.
guy, who was a well known direct mail consultant, I never thought I'd be able to connect with someone like him. Tell me over the phone, he'll do anything I want. He'll train me in direct mail. Um, he'll help me find cut rates in printing, everything. It was just a marvelous, marvelous thing. But of course, you see, this is how enterprise is built up. One thing leads to another, and if you achieve something, you achieve more. And so it was. I mean, ultimately, after getting rid of Elaine, um, and oh, I should mention this. John Nesbitt, the famous futurist, also heard of us and began reading my newsletter. And I came to him when we reached rock bottom in terms of our money. And he provided me with the only big grant I ever had. All my other grants were from from small donors. In fact, I had a ceiling of $1,000. I didn't want anyone to give me more than 1,000 because I didn't want anyone to have undue influence.
Yeah.
But John, bless his heart, gave me what today would be equivalent of $10,000, and with that, I was able to get to my first year's renewal notices. And so many people, I mean, well over 50% renewed, even in the first year, which is unheard of for an independent political newsletter. And long story short, that newsletter became sort of the go-to publication, political publication for people who were between just being status quo
Yeah.
and being Marxist. At the end of the 7 years, 8 years, it had become the second largest independent political newsletter in the country, and I loved it. And it had a what do you say, an advisory board of 100 people, all of whom had achieved stuff in their careers in terms of going beyond left and right. Many of them writers, many others working in organizations that were doing work. And the problem was, I didn't just want it to serve a laundry list of people around the country. I really wanted it to serve an organization because I wanted to build up an organization, not the New World Alliance again, but a more successful political organization that would go beyond left and right. This is where Charlene Spetnak comes in, and Fritjof Capra too. They were together writing a book based on their experiences with the Greens in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
called Green Politics.
Mm-hmm.
And they wrote me and they said they would like me to come out there for a week or more and spend some time going over the American section of their book because they'd known that I'd been working in this domain for 2 decades, and they thought my input would be useful. So after hiring Elaine, I went out to meet Charlene and Fritjof in order to not just I mean, I can confess this now, not just to help them with the book, but to try to inspire them and cajole them to help to start an organization based on the ideas they were writing about, namely green politics.
Yeah.
I cannot say that I'm the one that talked Charlene into doing this. A whole bunch of other people, after the book was published, also contributed to that. And she'd never done anything quite like that before. We had a wonderful, intimate relationship at first. We had a short affair, which was probably ill-advised on both of our parts. I'll let people read the book to figure out exactly why. But we did work together, more or less together, helping the Green Group for the first year. I answered a lot of the mail that they got, and I did contribute much to the American chapter. And she described me as one of the two American consultants on the book Green Politics. And after a year of going back and forth about whether she should do this or not, she finally decided to bring a small group together called the Green Politics Organizing Committee and start what became the Green Politics movement, which would eventually create the Green Party that we know today.
Yeah.
This is where the Green Politics chapter in Up From Socialism becomes really interesting and controversial.
Yeah.
I don't want to spoil it, but I will say that the problem, and this doomed the Greens from the start, just like I doomed the New World Alliance from the start. The Green Politics Organizing Committee, if the New World Alliance just had too many people, and should have been set up by me, the Green Politics Organizing Committee consisted of 5 people whose range was very narrow. There was a spiritual feminist, Charlene. There was a socialist. There was an anarchist, and there were 2 brilliant bioregionalists. They were all wonderful people, smart, insightful, caring, but their range was very narrow. I mean, you don't need to go through the list. There are no tenured academics, no one from business, no one from major nonprofits, no one from anyway, you name it. It was not there was nobody mainstream, and as a result, the people who they invited to the board, except for about 35 people who I got Charlene to allow this board to invite, no one that the board invited broke through that narrow group. It was an unbelievable, I mean, I think in all the years, all the decades of my being in the movement, it was the worst blown opportunity this country has ever seen to start a third party. Everyone in the mid-'80s wanted a third party to happen. A majority of American people then wanted a third party, even more people then than wanted one now. Politics was so ossified in those days. The people waiting in the wings to start the Green Party, assuming one had started, were stunning. Roger Craver, who I mentioned, would have helped them do fabulous direct mail. As I told you, he helped me build up New Options, basically from scratch, into a huge newsletter. Horace Busby, Lyndon Johnson's, one of Lyndon Johnson's chief aides, was a grand old man in Washington, and we had a great connection when I interviewed him for an article. And he said he had taken the Green representative around to meet all of his contacts on Capitol Hill. I mean, a lawyer who I got to come out to the first Green founding meeting said he'd have been happy to have the first Green organization in his office right there in DC, about
Yeah.
5 blocks from the White House. All of this was waiting for us, but this group and the group that came together in Minneapolis to found the Green Party movement was not having any of that. They were so marginalized. They were so mistrusting of the mainstream and of the old ways that they didn't want to have an office in Washington. At first, it was in Minneapolis, and then after the year, it was in Kansas City. For the first, I think, 8 years after that,
Was,
they did
was it
not.
the,
They did not want a leader. They did not want
yeah.
a single leader. They decided to have. They wouldn't even organize themselves at first. They decided to go back to their communities and do organizing. And in a couple of years, they would, if they had organized in their communities, they would have a green gathering. It was appalling. It was, I couldn't, I mean, like many people who came there from Washington, who were involved in Washington organizations, who had no standing in that group. Anyone who came from Washington, especially if they wore a suit, was looked down upon in our crew. I mean, I wasn't wearing a suit either. This is sort of, I was in between the two factions. It was very, very heartbreaking because I could see from the start what would happen. And I don't need to tell anyone watching what happened. Um, After a few years, after many Green gatherings, the far left essentially took over the Green movement, and it became your far left protest party, which is just, I mean, all that effort. You have to understand that Charlene and Fritjof, just like me, wanted to create an organization that went according to their own book, which was according to many of the Green activists at the time, especially in Europe, neither left nor right, but in front. They were there. Petra
Mhm.
Kelly, the leading Green spokesperson of the day in Germany, told me when I met her that three books that meant a lot to the Greens in Germany when they were getting off the ground was Murray Bookchin's books and Ted Rozak's books and My New Age Politics. The Greens and the transformational movement were like this. They were like
Yeah.
this. That the Green movement could not do any better than the New World Alliance. Oh, it did better in the sense that the Green Party eventually did arise, and it did manage to keep Al Gore from becoming president. But it in terms of its potential compared to what happened to it is gives me nightmares at night.
Mm.
It's so sad. Sometimes you feel blessed. You feel that God has given you the insight that you need, even when you don't have much money or many resources, to create something that's really essential in the world. And I feel to this day that I let people down, and uh, that many of us, in our different ways, not in my particular way, but in our different ways, which I spell out in my book, um, perhaps more explicitly than I should. No one is spared in the book, and no one is particularly seen as a bad guy either. Don't you agree with that, Jesse? Even when I'm critical of folks, um, nobody really nobody becomes a bad guy in my book. We're all
I don't
trying
know if I'd want to. I don't know if I'd want to take Charlene out to dinner.
when she allows you to trust her, which is
Yeah.
difficult for her for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Once you win her trust, she is wonderful. She's humorous. She's sly. She knows everything. And she's got 160 IQ, for God's sake. It's difficult being in the world when you're that smart. It just is.
Oh,
She
I hear ya.
had someone to marry who was just right for her, someone who was not in any way competitive with her, but who was an editor for Sierra Club books. So he knew what she knew, but he was not writing stuff that would compete with her stuff. She, of course, had very little nice things to say about new options or about new age politics. She was a good person. I hope that comes across, with the same kinds of problems that many activists had, maybe times two, just because she was so out there in her way. And I still feel very close to her, even though we haven't spoken for 2 decades. Um, and
I
nobody started the Green movement. It would not have started without her initiative. And you can
yeah.
never forget that, no matter how many chances she blew or how many organizing errors she made. Or John D. Marks, who you would know as one of the great mediators of our time, was at the first meeting pleading with Charlene and the other um, Green Politics Organizing Committee people, pleading with them basically to not make the mistakes that the New World Alliance made. But they would not listen to him, partly
To
because he wore a suit and a tie, and he spoke like the former State Department official that he was.
to me, that was the climax of the book, that gathering. It was so dramatic, um, because of, well, there was also a number of side stories that
Oh,
were that were just really well described, but it was perfect because you really set the scene. Again, another example of you putting the reader right in the middle of it, which I loved. But it was the climax because of what you're saying. It just was a huge missed opportunity. Am I correct to say, though, that I feel like you had that, the perspective you have now, I felt you had it then too in the book. I felt like you, in the moment, you were seeing it as a missed opportunity, given what was happening at the gathering, about not talking to the guy because he's got a suit on, to
yeah,
Mark, et cetera, et cetera. I felt like you were feeling it at the time and heartbroken by it.
yeah, yeah. I'd gone beyond that kind of alienation. Most of the people at the Green organizing meeting were more alienated than I was, and I was, as radical as New Options was becoming more successful, I was becoming more comfortable with success and
Mm-hmm.
was talking to a whole range of people, even though one of my favorite uh, um, advisors was Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground. I mean, I was beginning to want to listen to everyone, but I was not quite there yet. It took another 7 years of green gatherings before I finally came out on the other side and just got tired of living in the alternative world. To me, the most heartbreaking chapter in the book is the one right after that, where I talk about why I gave up New Options newsletter at the peak of its visibility. Um, I don't want to go over that chapter in detail either. It's again, the intricacy of it and the intensity of it. It really demands to be in the written word. But I'll mention one instance too. Maybe one is a friend of mine, Art Levine, built himself up from being a freelance writer in Washington, D.C., to being a very, very successful editor at U.S. News and World Report. And I went to I went to his birthday party, and I wanted to give him a gift that would show him that there's more to life than power and status, because he was there, man. He was there. I saw his office at U.S. News once, and he was living with a very power status conscious woman at the time, very unlike him. So I decided to bring him a beautiful 2-foot long, handcrafted in Kentucky unicorn. And I gave it to him at his birthday party in a box. And he was there with all his yuppie friends, other journalists around town, from the Washington Post, the Washingtonian, and the Washington Monthly, and all this stuff. And he, at his birthday party, unloaded it from the box onto the rug, and everyone roared with laughter.
Oh, yeah.
Terrible jokes about it. And it was horribly embarrassing to me. And I left the party as soon as I could, basically in tears. I won't tell you how that incident actually ended. I see you're smiling, but what it taught me in Thunder is that I was tired of being on the margins anymore. I was tired of writing for people on the margins. I was tired of writing only from my feelings. I needed desperately to learn how to write in the same analytic way that Art's yuppie friends from the Washingtonian and the Washington Post did. I flipped at that point. And there was another big flipping point that I'll mention briefly. Probably my best friend in the world, Jerry Goldfarb, was a lawyer from Los Angeles. He was in the New World Alliance. I got him invited to the Green meeting too. And he lived the way I did in those days, and the way many activists did, male and female in those days. We were too busy to have intimate life partners. So we jumped from relationship to relationship, often simply sleeping with our friends. Jerry did that even more than me. I mean, he had at one point a Porsche, and he was in a beautiful house in Malibu. Anyway, he finally got married, and within a few months of getting married, one of his ex-lovers shot him to death. It taught me a different lesson than the unicorn, really. It taught me that no matter how many new options you come up with, you cannot change human nature. No matter how feelingful you are, no matter how spiritual you are, no matter how understanding you are, things like jealousy and possessiveness cannot be kept at bay. There's just some things about the human creature that you have to understand. And if you want to run organizations and maintain friendships that are beautiful, you have to rein in your passions. That's just the law. To discover this at the age of 45 and not at the age of 20 or 25. And it's awful, but there it is for all to see.
The status thing is interesting. And well, I also think of it as, being careful and to not become a target. I mean, it's related. A lot of things come to mind. It's not necessarily where you're taking it in the book or anything, but, when you make after a certain amount of money too, you can become a target if you're not careful. And there's a temptation to be off the radar for guys like me. I just want to make enough money, or I can go out to dinner and not worry about the bill. But I don't know if I want to get too successful in whatever I'm doing, because it brings a whole slew of other problems.
Don't you want to be a fabulously successful podcaster?
Yes and no, but I'm very wary of it. I want to like go for my dreams and stuff, and I really want to go for it and make this life really extraordinary. I do want that, an extraordinary life, if I can pull it off.
Yes.
But I don't want it at the expense of me being corrupted. Just like anybody, I'm just as vulnerable to being corrupted by success and money. So I'm just very suspicious,
I
and I
don't,
hope will always be of that.
I don't see that, Jesse. I mean, just in a few instances I've had of talking with you, I mean, the thing is, if you pursue your dream and your dream requires you to talk intelligently and provocatively to people, be it in the music industry or the political industry, and you do it well, you're going to become a target. And why would you fight it? I mean, the success would come to you because you deserve it, not because I don't think you would seek it simply because you want to have your name in lights. There, I don't think that's what happens with people like us. We do what we want because we believe in it, and sometimes life propels us into the spotlight. It just does, and
Yeah.
you have to have the courage of allowing that to happen.
Yes, and I don't want to lose courage for something like that. I think, I'd like to think that that is true. Just there are people that have been very successful that have maintained a very level head, I think, and are
Yeah,
smart and don't compromise their principles at the end of the day, and they're able to have that balance. And there's some good role models out there, I think.
well,
Yeah,
have it.
like you, my friend.
Yeah, you have an intimate life partner
Yeah,
and you have a
yeah,
child. These are
yeah.
these are all essentials.
They're good anchors.
And you've
They're
been,
great anchors.
I mean, you're not going to believe this coming from me. You've been in the Army. You've been in the Marine Corps.
Marine Corps, yeah.
Yeah, it all helps.
I think it does, but I'm vulnerable just like anybody else, and I think I'm thinking that because of the people at the party where you brought the unicorn.
Mhm.
Those people might have started with genuine hearts, such as yourself, wanting to do good, and then got bit by the bug. And it sounds like you got bit by it a little bit, right?
Well,
To want to write to a certain audience as opposed to, you said you wanted to stop writing from your heart because you wanted to kind of maybe I heard you wrong, but more sophisticated, quote unquote, with
mm,
that community.
yeah. Well, no. You heard two things, and I probably should have made myself more clear. I didn't want to stop writing for my activist alternative audience. I wanted to broaden my audience.
Hmm.
So if I wrote with more rationality and less pure heart, I would
Oh,
be able
gotcha.
to be understood by a greater range of people, and I would be able to write more persuasively, so that I mean, people already agreed with me, loved my writing, but I
Yeah.
wanted to be able to write for instance, the people in the I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. I wanted people in the different congressional audiences to read me.
Gotcha. Now, I'm glad you
It
clarified that.
wasn't, it wasn't the,
It was to get through to them, not so you could be a part of them and
no,
be, yeah.
no,
Yes, I got you
no,
now.
I'm afraid. I mean, it's 78. I've learned that I'm never going to be a part of, part of anyone. I'm not even exactly part of the radical middle. We can get to that in a moment. But the other thing that you misread is I I didn't feel I didn't mean to put down the people that were at Art's party. They were very different from me. They
Mhm.
were successful at what they did. And what I meant to say is I didn't want to tell Art that he shouldn't be successful like them. I didn't want him I didn't want him to forget when he was an editor at US News and World Report that 15 years ago when I'd met him, he was writing like I was for New Age Journal, and he was writing humor pieces for Harper's Magazine. And he was letting his hair down in these publications in ways that his current position wouldn't allow him to do. To not to keep your integrity, but also to be in a position of power and status is very difficult. But it's a challenge, but it's not one that should be shunned, particularly by people with good hearts, such as I imagine you are.
So, and that's why he was a unicorn, right? Or that's why that for the gift. He maintained integrity.
It wasn't just any unicorn. It was a beautiful unicorn.
I wonder why people were laughing. I know because they're different, but just because
it was so out of place. It was so out of place. I mean, Art was getting a lot of the typical presents that you get from people who've made it. He was getting a sex manual, for instance. He was getting cufflinks. He was getting a whole range of stuff that people would get when they're on top of the world. And then he gets this unicorn. And I suspect people saw it as just too different. Somebody muttered from across the room, somebody from the Washington Monthly muttered, Art has some very strange friends.
Well, I bet Art appreciated it.
No, well, yes and no. I mean, it embarrassed him. One of the subtle things in that scene is where his lady, his girl, puts a hand on his shoulder when he was telling barroom jokes about the unicorn. She was telling him to calm down, but he in the moment. Art is a very funny person. He could easily be a stand-up comic, and he milked the unicorn for as long as he could.
So what's next? So what's next in the journey?
I went to law school.
That's when you went to law school.
My wonderful lawyer friend. I couldn't understand why I wanted to be a lawyer, but I ultimately did some investigation and discovered that lawyers were to be a lawyer in this country anyway, is to be able to both help people and be in the midst of everything. And most important of all for me, to learn how to be an analytic person, not just a heart person. So I needed and wanted all of that. And I also knew, being somewhat strategic, that if I wanted to go to law school, one of the only ways an older guy can do that, especially since I didn't have my father's money or blessing, and I had no money for my newsletter, was I had to get student loans. And you could, in fact, get student loans to go to law school, no matter how old you are, so long as you did okay on the law student's admissions test. Mm-hmm. So in my last year of writing New Options and feeling ambivalent about it, I was also studying for the LSAT. And my secret then was I was enjoying studying for the LSAT a lot more than I was enjoying writing New Options. So I finally gave it up. People thought I was nuts because, as I say, it was at the peak of its influence. And I have to say that was even harder than dropping out of University of Toronto Graduate School. That was the hardest decision I ever made in my life, because I loved New Options. I loved the people I was writing it for. And I wished to hell that I could have figured out some way to get from there, this emotive, alternative person, to being a more analytic mainstream person without going through that fire of the law. But I couldn't do it. Maybe if I was in an intimate relationship with someone my age who had already done that in their own life, And I tried a couple of those people, as is obvious from the book, but it just wasn't working. It didn't connect for me. So I went off alone with nothing. It's just as I, just when I went up to Canada, I had nothing. When I came down from Canada, I had nothing. And I went off to New York University School of Law. Um, I had nothing
Yeah.
but student loan.
And you ate it up, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually had to borrow money from one of my friends to be able to afford to get up to New York, and I paid him out of my first student loan check. Um, I had to buy decent clothes during my first semester. I had nothing proper to wear. It was very, very interesting. I chose NYU because I really wanted to go to a top 10 law school. I didn't want to go to an Ivy League school. And I'd heard good things about it, that if you wanted to go to NYU, it was very much into social change there. And it is. In fact, if you look at NYU promotional brochures, promotional videos now, I mean, they read like they're joining Antifa or something. It's so completely oriented to trying to bring in kids who want to devote their lives to social change. But in the 1990s, it was one of the few law schools that was out front that way. And of course, that appealed to me then. I thought I'd feel comfortable there, even as I learned the analytic aspects of the law.
Yeah.
And so I did. It was a struggle. And that struggle is anatomized in the book. Um, the hippie activist learns to be an analytic person who works hard and crosses his T's and struggles with all this stuff, all the stuff you have to learn to get decent grades in college. And boy, did I embarrass myself a few times. But we'll leave those embarrassments to the reader. Um, Suffice it to say that many people who were my age were going back to school in those years. I estimate that at least 500,000 people who from the boomer generation went back to school, either graduate school to finish their BA or to professional school like I did. At least 500,000 went back, not to make more money, but simply to be more effective in their careers or in their avocations. I did not feel alone doing that. There were plenty of older students there, though I was the oldest by several years. And that was nice. And it was very illuminating. It said to me that many of us hadn't really prepared ourselves properly to do the political and social change work that we needed to. And many of those people are now doing wonderful work today. When I got out of law school, I learned what I wanted. And what I especially learned many times over is that in order to truly understand a subject, you have to go at it from all angles. In our classes, we did that in many different ways. Even professors who were very, very partisan, usually left-wing partisan, such as Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, who I took for a semester, to the extent that they were law professors, forced us to approach cases from all sides and really forced us to understand why people would be making the arguments they were making. It was a great education for anyone who wants to do political work in their lives, because it teaches you to see the world the way others do, not just superficially, but to see the real reasons, the objective reasons why people might feel and think differently from you. It's a profound lesson. and you can't just get it from a lecture. I'm sorry, you really need to get it from a course of study. Anyway, after 3 years, um, I was doing well enough in school to get a job, which I was worried about after first year. And my law professors were the same way. They all forced me to think thoroughly about who our opponents were and why they thought the way they did. And I had to write and rewrite briefs and memos so many times. It was awful to think about the trees I was wasting, but it was fabulous education. And after a couple of years, I had enough, and I quickly found a couple of people, mostly older kids from my law school, who helped me think through a new political newsletter called Radical Middle that would take all the lessons I learned about seeing things from all sides and what I'd learned about business, what I'd learned about um, the professional world, um, and incorporate all those lessons into the new newsletter that became Radical Middle. So I went back to Washington after taking a year off, hanging out with people and just decompressing in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Colorado, and raising another $90,000 or $80,000, which is well over $200,000 in today's change, and coming back to Washington, D.C. and starting a new newsletter.
Yeah.
And I did the whole damn thing over again.
To a great success again.
Well, it wasn't loved in the way that New Options was. It was successful. It was financially successful enough to allow me to feed myself. And the circulation never approached what New Options had, though in that case, it was already competing with the wonderful internet. And I didn't really want to go online. I later put many of my better articles online, so you can find them now if you look up Radical Middle Newsletter. But It was really an online publication, and I mean, I face it, I'm a print guy. I just am. My website, Radical Middle Newsletter, which I haven't contributed to since I started the book. But if you look at it, it looks just like a newsletter. It looks just like the kind of website that would be designed by somebody who's into political print political newsletters. It looks so old-fashioned. I'm sure people laugh when they go to it. Anyway, there it is for if anyone wants to see it. But I dearly recommend my Up from Socialism book instead. It's a much more intricate and humanly compelling version of the same thing.
Is it accurate to say that the amalgamation of the newsletters for Radical Middle led to the processing what you would put in the book later, Radical Middle? The politics we need right now?
Yeah. Yes. The book that came out of the newsletter. I'm sorry, I see what you're saying. The book that I wrote in 2004 was in fact based largely on articles in the newsletter. The
4 pillars you bring up, do you regard them as still relevant? You know, the maximize choices for Americans, guarantee a fair start in life, maximize American potential, and be a genuine help to everyone in the developing world. Do those still stand since 2004 to you?
Well, I'd love to see a country where all those where those 4 values are lived up to. Yes, I would, and I think that each of those values leads to wonderful new policy proposals that should be just debated and passed, and that a political organization could base its outlook on. But they're not dyed in the wool. They're a nice way to organize the chapters of my book. Um,
Yeah.
I think I mean I did in the book connect different policy proposals to each of those but it becomes somewhat confusing. For example, I would love to see a national service, a 1 year national service required of everyone, and
Yeah.
that could be, I mean, you could put that under two or three of those values that you just enumerated. So those values have limited use value. But if one is going to start an organization again based on radical centrist values, I would like to see a couple of values enumerated much more simply.
Well, I think they're general enough, but enough meat on the bones to get someone started in the right direction. But one question I had is, the fourth pillar, be a genuine help to everyone in the developing world. For some reason, that I could ask about any country, but what's your thoughts on Ukraine? Do you consider that help? Because it's not exactly Vietnam, but some are calling it a proxy war.
Well, it's beyond my pay grade at this point in my life. Um, I hate to. My feeling is that Russia under Putin is extremely dangerous and needs to be stopped. How we stop him is beyond me. But no, I don't think he should be allowed to take over the country if that's what you want. His war aims must be delimited in some way, and I do not. I mean, this is also personal to me. My ancestors come to Ukraine. We were driven out because of anti-Semitism. I'm not convinced that the Ukraine has yet dealt with its anti-Semitic elements. So I really, I want Ukraine to be in NATO? No. Do I think having NATO countries on Russia's borders provocative? Yes, I do. I wish we could reconsider that. On the other hand, I try to live in the real world, and I don't think we need to concede that to Putin right now. But you just hope that adults are in power who understand that Putin can't be allowed to achieve all of his war aims in Ukraine. But beyond that, I'm not in the war room right now, nor do I belong being there. And it's a constitutional republic. I
Yeah.
put people there who who can consider this question from all sides, as I was saying earlier, and do what's in not just America's best interests, but what's in the West's best interests and in the world's best interests, because
Yeah.
we're in all three.
It's very complicated. I have felt very strongly one way, and then it's all muddled in my head how I feel about it now. And I don't know if it's what kind of influences. I ingest information from all kinds of sources, and it's so hard to verify what's real and what's right.
Yeah.
It's a challenging thing. I think like all things, there's probably a little bit of both. There's probably some nefarious stuff with the war effort and lining people's pockets, and the military industrial complex probably has a big role in this. I think
As
potentially.
always, yes.
Yeah, I think even the company I work for, my day job, has a role in it, to be quite honest.
Does it make you want to quit?
Um, Well, I don't know. I mean, when I first heard Putin invading Ukraine, I was very angered by it,
Yes.
because I thought Putin, this was his crown jewel. He wants it back, because didn't kind of Russia and all that kind of start from the heart of Ukraine, and so it's very meaningful to Russia. But they're a democratic country. They weren't in NATO, yet he was worried about it. And then people would say, "Well, we caused him to do it because we beefed up our NATO presence, and so we forced his hand." And I'm like, "Whose side are you on?" but there may be some truth to that, and like I said, it's complicated and it's totally above my pay grade as well. So I can't pretend to know.
There's truth to all of it, and that's why, I mean, again, we live in a constitutional republic, and I just hope the people we elected to go over this, who know much more than we do about the real situation there, I'm sure of that, will make the right moves and will tell us with some degree of transparency what they're doing and why.
Yeah, it's I've always had this struggle. I got a lot of in grad school. I think I might have told you I went to school for conflict analysis and resolution.
Yeah.
And there, I was president of the class, and I had a newsletter actually called Fact et Verba for the students.
Mhm.
And everybody was at the time, it was 2003, maybe a little bit before Radical Middle came out, and people were from my school were protesting the Iraq War. And at the time, that was my point. I said, I didn't go. And I wrote an article on it and said, hey, I'm not going because I don't really know what's what. I don't know that this isn't a just war. I don't know that he's not telling the truth, that there's biological and chemical weapons. I'm not privy to those conversations at those levels of government. So I'm not going to protest something that I don't have all the information on.
Right.
And I got hell for that.
Yes.
What's interesting about it is that it turned out to be kind of a bullshit war, because they lied about it. But maybe it was more complicated, and I'm oversimplifying it. But it turned out to be not such a great war, and didn't lead to anything, any value, and we lost all those lives. And it's just an interesting thing for me to look back on. Is like maybe that was worthy to protest, but at the time, I was like, I don't have the information. But I feel that's a constant tug and pull type, tug of rope. What am I trying to say? Tightrope.
Tug of war.
Tug of war. Geez, you want to do good in the world, and sometimes good means challenging authority, but it's easily to be inhibited to challenge authority because you don't have all the information, which I think is somewhat reasonable.
Yes.
But it's like when you decide, it's kind of like I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany. For some reason, he saw the evil and fought against it. But a lot of people, and I understand this, they either didn't want to see it or downplayed it, and then maybe at one point actually turned a blind eye to all the genocide and what was going on. But how did Dietrich Bonhoeffer know to fight it so early on? And it's just a challenging thing to know when to fight and when to maybe leave it alone, because you don't have all the information.
A delicate question.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the fighting that you did in Vietnam?
Well, my dad just thought he was serving his country. And he, when everybody was being drafted, my dad signed up. And he thought it was the right thing to do because he believed in America. And so I think his intentions were all genuine. And I don't know if I should ask him,
You've never asked him how he feels
I
now?
I've asked him, but I think it didn't go past. I just wanted to serve my country. But
Mhm.
since then, what's interesting about my father is, he went on to become president of World Vision, the largest Christian relief and development organization,
Oh,
in
goodness.
the 80s, in '87,
Yeah.
and he went. I went back with him to Vietnam.
Oh, fast.
Uh, Yeah, which was really it's turned out to be a big story in our family and in World Vision, where he brought a letter from Ronald Reagan saying, hey, we're here to now we're here to help you out. And the Vietnamese were like, hey, screw you. You guys invaded our country. We didn't want you here then. We don't want you here now. Um, and it's a weird thing to get into, but I remember speaking up at that meeting. I was 12 years old at the time, and it's in my dad wrote a book. It's in his book, but I said, hey, my dad he's genuine. He just wants to help you out. And
Mhm.
I think everybody thought it was insane that a 12-year-old was talking, and everybody kind of let their guard down. And then World Vision got let in.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And that's not the point of the story, but the point is that he went back to do as much as he could in the position he was in to help Vietnam. So
That
there
is,
must have been some kind of reconciliation
yes, yes, that is
he
exactly
needed.
the story. Yes, of course. It was a
Yeah,
reconciliation. And it wasn't just minor, it was major.
I have talked to him about it, but I think at the time it was just, hey, this is what we do. We serve our country. That's the right thing to do. Um, and I don't think in his area, well, I mean, you could maybe say this about where you grew up too, in Michigan and in Texas. But he grew up in rural New Jersey, and you just didn't question, your country. You
Mhm.
kind of just
Yes,
did what you thought it was expected of you.
yes, the deserters we got in Canada during the Vietnam War, they'd all gone in with exactly that point of view. They had, I mean, many of them, they were so naive. Many of them didn't realize that being in the army in Vietnam meant that they would have to kill people. It just didn't sink in until they were there with guns, and it was the strangest thing. Um, People are much more sophisticated now than they were 60 years ago about that sort of thing. It's incredible how naive some of those deserters were or claimed to have been.
Yeah, and with the benefit of hindsight, I think everybody gets the respect maybe that's due to them, whether you protested the war or you went to war. I mean, coming back and getting spit on after you're just doing what you're told to do is awful. But, guys like Muhammad Ali, who got so much criticism for, he's like, no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word, I mean,
Yep.
you got to respect that now too, but he didn't, not back then. He got a lot of grief for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. Well,
But
we've all taken our turns getting grief. For,
but
and we,
maybe that's kind of the point, and then the point of your story is that, there's not necessarily a black and white evil all the time. Maybe there is. We're not afforded that all the time. So you have to choose your battles and fight with humility, I think. With understanding your opponent, like you learned in law school, but understanding your opponent also maybe enough to love your opponent too, to challenge your opponent with love. I mean, that
well,
sounds a little cheesy, but
yeah. Ultimately, you want to work with your opponent to come up with policy proposals that can be shared.
hey, how about this? You have one quote I wanted to ask you about.
Uh-oh.
Um, you said, and I knew this aversion to getting one's hands dirty would keep us from ever being able to take our movement beyond the world of think tanks and big ideas. So my question is, what did you mean by getting your hand? I think I kind of know, but getting your hands dirty. And do we need to get our hands dirty today if we're trying to promote maybe a greater idea or good?
I remember that quote. That is from Socialism. I'm talking about the radical centrist movement, or the radical centrist quote movement, end quote, because it really doesn't exist as a movement yet. It exists, just as it says in the quotes, in think tanks and in glossy magazines. Before it can become a movement, oh, I should also add, it exists in groups like the Forward Party and No Labels, groups that are constantly talking about running a third-party candidate for office. You remember that No Labels did not run a third-party candidate in this election because it was afraid that doing so might tilt the election to Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The Forward Party didn't run a candidate for president this time because it felt that only states should figure out what it believes anymore. It didn't want to do something grandiose like come up with proposals, let alone a candidate on a national level. The No Labels did create a booklet full of unbelievably milquetoasty policy proposals that would attract nobody. They were so laden with compromise that there was no oomph to them. This is what I mean. Without creating an organization that can fight for these ideas, that can fight for radical centrist ideas, if you want to use that term, or transpartisan ideas in the public dialogue, all you're going to have is essays and people mouthing off in talk shows and I'm sorry to say podcasts. You need organizations, and you need and what I'm talking about is you need organizations that will bring people from all the different groups together to hammer out policy proposals that are bold, that speak to their deep interests rather than to their superficial positions on issues. Anyone who wants to do that kind of organization is, of course, going to get their hands dirty. Mm-hmm. First of all, everyone on the left and right is going to hate them. So how you're going to get people from the different organizations to actually going to come together and work out mutually agreeable policies will require a lot of people's feelings getting hurt and people cutting themselves off from their funders, as I've cut myself off from my funders just by writing my last 2 books. It's just to be a radical centrist is not the most popular place to be. And when you start talking about not just coming up with ideas, but creating a group that will bring people from different groups together to work out a new politics, to develop a new kind of radicalism, a radicalism that doesn't have one that isn't about extremes, but that's about mutually coming together around exciting new ideas to create a whole new American philosophy for the 21st century. Who that's politically active now in organizations will want that? Do you think a democratic socialist America wants to hear that, or the equivalents on the right want to hear that? No, they don't want to hear it. And if you start actually to pull people out of their groups to do it, you are going to be in Dutch. You need to have a media that will talk about that to keep that from happening at all. And guess what? We really do not have a media that pays attention to this. It's absurd that wonderful, wonderful groups. One of the great things my editor, Adam Bellow, son of Saul Bellow, by the way, the Nobel Prize winning novelist, made me do in my book before he'd allow it to be published, is write something about the 40 or 50 terrific books that are being written now that can push people in a transformational, transpartisan, or radical centrist direction. There's almost nothing about them. I mean, for that reason alone, I think my book is worth reading in universities, because no one is talking about that stuff. I don't mean to toot my own horn, but it's amazing that there's nothing quite like my book in the literature. Hardly anyone even knows that there was a movement that lasted, and it's just continuing to go on in its different guise for over 60 years. That was not about the left, not about social democracy, not about libertarianism, but was about coming up with a genuinely American, radical centrist point of view that would bring everyone together in a healthier way, and that brought together people's hearts as well as their souls and policy intellects. And to the extent that my book helps people do that before they get involved in social change, or when they're in the middle of it, or toward the end of their lives. And I actually, one other wonderful thing Adam did is he realized that he's in his 60s and I'm in my 70s, so he figured he better assign a younger person to help edit the book. So besides him, he had a person in their 20s, one of those really bright gals in their 20s who are all over the literary landscape in New York now, go over my book and help me orient it to people in their 20s and 30s and even 40s, as you are. I don't know if you could tell that, but you could tell maybe sometimes that I was straining to make myself understandable to younger cohorts.
Well, okay, it broke through to me, and I would think if people younger than me are exposed to it, it will break through to them.
Time will tell. My best 2 reviews were in the last couple of months.
Yeah, I've read some of the reviews you sent out. I think it's amazing. I think that's a good spot to end, Mark. What do you think? I think that was a great.
Well, all these endings are arbitrary. But it's been forever. They say there shouldn't be forever wars, right? But it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope it's useful to anyone who's dipped into this. And if they'd like to get in touch with me, I'm easy to reach. Just the best thing is to read my book, Read Up from Socialism. It says more about me than I even meant to say. But, if you want to talk to me personally, just type email and then my name, or I guess you type my name and then email into Google, and there are a couple of sites that will pull my email up for you. So do that. I like talking to people, as you can see from this from the eyeglasses. To remind you guys, I'm basically blind now, so I hardly read anything anymore, but short personal emails with my wonderful huge computer screen and magnifying glass I can deal with. So
and you look cool doing it.
What?
You look cool doing it.
Thank you, Sandra. Sandra says so too.
Hey, give my best to Sandra.
I will.
Well, I'll be working on this, and I love the book, and I also think it's a great reference, like you said, to organizations and other books that people have put out that we covered last time a little bit too. So we'll make sure to try to give as many quick links as possible in the description as they relate to our talk as well, so that they can have maybe a distilled list, at least as much as YouTube will let us, that they can click to from your book.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. It's been wonderful.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Really appreciate your time. Hey, we're glad we figured out the technology. Until next time. Until
All right.
part 3.
Okay. I'll be around, I think.
All right, Mark. Nice to talk to you. Nice to see you again.
Take care.
All right. See you later.